so we were playing volleyball together, basketball, rollerblading around the meditation hall, thinking of fun things to do together a lot, even as we were very dedicated to our mindfulness practice. So people would come there and experience so much joy. I remember one time someone coming, this was in Deer Park in California, saying, "This is the most, joyful Christmas I've ever experienced at a Buddhist monastery. It's the happiest Christmas I've ever had." And he was, probably in his 60s by then. So all of that, way of being in the moment, being present with ourselves and our pain, transforming our pain, knowing that was really a key part of our path as practitioners, allowed us to have this incredibly deep joy that people could just tap into as soon as they got there. They could feel it, that, wow, this is something different.
I wonder if earlier when I was asking about the average person, maybe being bemused about, well, when we choose monastic life, maybe they don't understand there's rollerblading and lots of fun things to do as well. Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Kaira Jewel Lingo. Kaira Jewel is a Dharma teacher whose work focuses on the intersection of meditation and social justice. She spent 15 years living as a nun in a Buddhist monastery in the Plum Village tradition under the guidance of Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh. In 2007, she became a Zen teacher after receiving lamp transmission from Thich Nhat Hanh and is also a teacher in the Vipassana Insight lineage through Spirit Rock Meditation Center in the US. She's the author of We Were Made for These Times, Skilfully Moving Through Change, Loss and Disruption, the co-author of Healing Our Way Home, Black Buddhist Teachings on Ancestors, Joy and Liberation, which was co-written with Valerie Brown and Marisela Gomez. And she's also the editor of Thich Nhat Hanh's book, Planting Seeds, Practicing Mindfulness with Children. Today, we discuss her many years of monastic life, and I got carried away asking questions about that, so we didn't get a chance to talk about her work in engaged Buddhism and social justice, but hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that on a future occasion. Hope you enjoy the conversation. I heard you say when you were a nun, you referred to as Sister Jewel. Was that a name that came from, was that like as part of being ordained?
Yes, that was,
Oh, okay.
I was true adornment with jewel. That was my name as a nun, Chan Cho Miem.
Oh, great.
Vietnamese, yeah.
And actually, I've never started, I think, by dwelling on someone's name before, but I think it was in Healing Our Way Home, you also discuss the origins of Kyra, which was also quite interesting.
Yeah. So my mom chose that name from the Bible, from the Greek word kairos, which means the fullness of time, the fullness of the present moment, which is distinct from chronos, chronological time, where we're sort of hemmed in by the realities of, our human and material world. Kairos is this expanded sense of time, outside of time, actually. It's interesting that that's one of the definitions of, it's one of the characteristics of the Dharma, is akaliko in Pali, is outside of time. Meaning, things can happen at very different speeds. People in the Buddha's time met him and awakened immediately without needing a lot of time, or, there's just all these ways in which the Dharma operates, not according to our usual experience of chronological time. So anyway, I always knew that it was sort of the kairotic moment of the time when Jesus would really, his presence would be felt. That's how it was used in the Bible. But I learned later, after I had become a nun, that it meant also the fullness of the present moment. And I thought, wow, how did my parents know that I would grow up and live and be taught by sort of, the father of mindfulness, as Thich Nhat Hanh is often described. So
yeah, I think that the sense of the kind of the eternal nature of the present moment is, I think sometimes when people hear eternal, they think going on for a really long time, instead of, as you say, kind of like outside of time is this kind of quality of, the present moment. And I'd love to get into you talking about you have a very interesting history, but even before going to become a nun with Thich Nhat Hanh, your childhood also is quite interesting, if you wouldn't mind sharing about that.
Sure. So I'm a a child of an interracial marriage, a Black mother from the west side of Chicago, and a white father from Houston, Texas. Um, and they met in Chicago in the 60s. Both of them were part of a family religious order, so a Christian residential community that was, came together to renew the church. They really had high aspirations for making Christianity something really radical by living with the poor, by taking vows of poverty and obedience to the community, and kind of creating a lay monastic order, so couples, children, but all pooling, resources, basically begging, relying on in-kind gifts, so food and donations, so that they could dedicate themselves to creating human and village development projects all over the world. So there were projects in slums and ghettos and rural areas and Native American reservations and all over the world. By the 70s, there was a human development project in every time zone. So there were thousands of people that joined this community, and they had, houses, religious houses with priors, all these, monastic language, where, there would be daily office. So there would be prayers in the morning, every morning, singing, and we'd cook in common. We'd, eat together. We'd, when I was from 8 to 12, our family moved to Nairobi, to a slum on the outskirts of Nairobi named Kawangware. We lived over a bar, so we would hear, jukebox music playing until late in the night, and and walk through the market, and goats would be giving birth right on the side of the road. And anyway, it was a really powerful experience for me at that age to be in Africa. But it was this community that was very international. So it started in the US, so most of the people were from the US, but there were many people from India and from Asia and from Latin America and from Australia. And, down the street in Chicago where we lived at the main house, there was, a Coptic priest, Father Michael, who had joined the community. And, so I grew up around all these people from all these places who all wanted to live simply, care for, the most vulnerable, and were willing to live very simply and to give up, their comforts and this, American dream, the capitalist, get mine, take care of my family. They were all giving that up to do something else.
Right. And then
Yeah.
the jump from there to, I guess it's not a jump to really go from that kind of childhood through to monastic life. Feels like it probably made it feel less friction than maybe for the average person. But I've heard you say elsewhere a story of listening to Ram Dass give a talk when you were at college. Was that a kind of a turning point?
Yeah, yeah. So we left the community when I was 14, and I felt very lost because I had lived kind of really very communally my whole life, and suddenly it was me and my father. By that time, my parents had divorced, so my brother was in college, and it was my father and his fiance. So we're just three of us, and I was like, I remember walking home from high school one day and like, this can't be it. This can't be all that life is. It's like all these people in their own homes, living very separate lives. And so I went to college, chose the most communal living situations, the co-ops, and where we, did our own cleanup and cooking instead of, having a university staff to do that. Made decisions by consensus and had 5-hour long meetings to figure out each quarter who would be in which room and who would have which job. And anyway, still in my studies, I had begun meditating by then, doing yoga, really interested in the spiritual dimension, and I got a great education and still felt like the kind of the best professors that I felt had the best analysis of like the systemic nature of oppression and what liberation could really look like. They didn't have a spiritual framework. And I really started to sense like, well, there's something missing, and around that time I did hear Ram Dass come to our school, and he said, you learn a lot here, but you don't learn how to be happy. And that was really something that struck a chord, because I had been thinking of, I did a bachelor's, I did a master's sort of at the same time. So in 4.5 years, I had a master's. I was planning to go ahead and do a PhD. And then when he said that, I thought, gosh, I don't want to be an unhappy professor. you People were very accomplished around me academically, but I didn't know if they were happy. And so I thought, I want to find a spiritual teacher and a spiritual community, and I want to learn how to be happy. So after I graduated, I I took a year to travel. I went to India for 3 months, stayed at ashrams, and visited holy places. And as part of that year, I planned to spend the summer retreat at Plum Village in France. And as soon as I saw Thai, I knew he was my teacher, the one I had been looking for. And I was also very impressed by the community, which really practiced his teachings. So I canceled the rest of my trip around Europe, and I spent 4 more months in Plum Village.
Right. So
And
yeah,
at the end
for
of,
anyone, sorry,
go ahead.
I was going to say for anyone who doesn't know, Thai is the name Thich Nhat Hanh students used for him, right? Is it teacher in Vietnamese?
Yes, that's right.
Right.
And so, yeah, so I stayed there for another 4 months, and I just decided I wanted to be a nun at the end of that time, because I was so moved. I thought, wow, this is so important to me, what we're doing here. Why don't I do it all the time instead of working to just come and do it for a week or two at a time?
I think for a lot of people, the the idea of moving to a monastery would be obviously quite radical, and the
Mm.
sense of, I guess, worldly attachments of the way we're kind of raised to think that, when you said, is this all there is? Like, getting a job and living in your nuclear family, and
Mm.
there's so much kind of, that's what we're raised to kind of value typically. And so I think for some people, there could be especially if they don't meditate, there could be a sense of like what could possibly be on offer in terms of
Mm.
one's inner world that could be so big, so important that it could outweigh all of that. Is more a reflection on the magnitude of the spiritual life, like in terms of compared to worldly attachments,
Mm.
is something. I think you're probably so steeped in it at this point in your life that you maybe are less in touch with the average person who might be like, why would you do that? But it might be hard to even put into words the answer to the question of like why you would do that.
Mm. Prioritize spiritual life
Yeah,
and
exactly.
living in a monastery. Yeah, I'm sure it had to do with how I was raised,
Yeah.
and having that deep sense of sort of spiritual fulfillment. Even as a child, I'm sure I didn't know what really was going on in a verbal sense or cognitive, rational sense, but I felt it. I felt, every morning we would be woken up at 5 o'clock with a bell and, a kind of prayer. And then we'd go downstairs, and there would be chanting and candles. It would be dark. It would be incense. So there was this sense of holiness, of like something bigger. There was mystery there that I really connected to as a child. So I'm sure that's part of what allowed me to feel so open to this kind of call to something else. Um, but I also, one of the things I experienced there that first summer was I cried every day. And I always consider myself to be a happy person in general. And I was, but I just had a lot of things that were buried that didn't have
Mm.
a way to really get, you know, I felt what I felt in Plum Village was I could really be myself for the first time. I could let who I was show, like there was space for that, there was room and acceptance. And so the tears were really just all these things that I hadn't been able to grieve, all these things about myself, about my life, about the world that I didn't know how to be with, that there was space now for them to come up and come out in very loving community. And, you know, as strange as it sounds that I cried every day, that was the happiest I had ever been. I never had felt so happy until that point. And those two things go together. Like
Yeah.
when you touch your pain, and you can let it be there and hold it, you have the capacity to access joy in ways you wouldn't otherwise have. And so, you know, so much was happening in me. I remember calling my dad, calling my mom, and saying, "This is amazing what I found here. It just feels so," we were doing a lot of work on ancestors at the retreat, and touching the earth is a very crucial, kind of essential Plum Village practice. We were reflecting on our parents and how our parents had shaped us, and then our grandparents and how they had shaped us, like that they are flowing into us, they are us. There's a lot of ancestral healing that was happening for me. My family, coming from an interracial family, there was a lot of, pain and trauma, of like my dad's family kind of kicking him out of the family when he married my mom.
Wow.
And so we didn't meet them until after the divorce, when I was like, 8 or 9. And, so a lot of, I remember calling them and feeling so inspired by what I was learning, and just wanting them to have the experience. So my dad actually was able to come and do a retreat at Plum Village, do a retreat with Thai that same summer, and started a Sangha in Atlanta that's been going now over 26 years, since 1997. He's been doing that, maybe 27, 28 years now. Anyway, it just was like a huge shift in my life and in my family's life, actually. And so, yeah, I think, it wasn't the biggest leap for me, like we've already talked about, given my background, but also what happened for me there was so life-changing that it wasn't that, it was
Yeah.
a lot of young people, a lot of people were ordaining at that time because they were having these really profound experiences of healing, of seeing things. I remember one of the sisters that I was close to, she talked about, she had been a banker, and she had a friend, or someone close to her, either died or was very hurt in an accident that just happened very suddenly, a car accident, I think. And that was a huge wake-up call for her. And she was like, I don't know how long I have. I want to live in a really profound and meaningful way immediately, like as soon as I can. I want to dedicate my life. So things, people had
Yeah.
these experiences that led them, they have very different backgrounds than me, but they would encounter the practice, they would encounter Thai's teaching, and something would just resonate, and they would say, I got to do this with my whole life.
Yeah. Yeah, I really
Um,
appreciate that response, because I think what I was reaching for was that I think someone who doesn't have a spiritual practice, who looks at monastic life, is probably not coming at it from that depths of experience that would convince
mm,
someone, not even convince me mentally, just pull you in that direction. If you're coming at it from a kind of thinking it through, well, should I join? Blah, blah, from that kind of weighing up the pros and cons.
mm,
We're talking about, I guess, we're talking about experience as opposed to ideas. That
mm,
everything you described is really, really beautiful. And yeah, and you mentioned earlier that as you mentioned spiritual fulfillment, and that feels like a
mm,
kind of fulfillment feels like an important word in terms of
mm,
expressing why one might put spirituality at the fore of one's life, because
mm,
the the mode of living that you were describing, where you're like, this can't be it. It's almost as if I think that the kind of the sense of self operating from that mode, it presumes dissatisfaction or separation, or that something, it kind of, the whole game set up for it to not feel fulfilling and right. And like the
mm,
very first move is away from wholeness.
mm, mm,
So it
mm,
makes sense that, yeah, as you said, kind of profundity, homecoming,
mm,
meaning, all of
mm,
that stuff would go along with this.
Mhm.
the shift into this mode of life. And also, Eldrin, you said that the happiness and the sadness went together, because in
Mm.
my own experience, the first time I touched grief that I'd been
Mm.
repressing, it felt bad. Like my mind thought it was bad. It didn't want to go there.
Mm.
And
Mm.
now it's one of my favorite things to feel, because it feels it. I can't differentiate it from love, from
Mm.
general just kind of openness and
Mhm.
connection, and it just feels like
Mhm.
movement and openness.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Mm. Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, I read recently grief is a flavor of love,
Hmm.
right? We don't grieve unless we love. And so that's so beautiful what you just shared.
Yeah, I guess love
Um,
plus impermanence equals grief being inevitable.
yes.
But so
Mm.
your training with Thich Nhat Hanh was, so he, for people who aren't familiar, was Zen, Vietnamese Zen lineage
Hmm.
was his background, right? And so was the
Yeah.
practice mainly meditate, like mindfulness on the breath and walking,
Wow.
or was it
You
a lot?
know, it's so much what he was teaching, but what I love that he would often say is the essence of his teaching was two sentences. I have arrived. I am home. So this deep, back to the Kairos and the uh, Chronos, I have arrived is really, um, I, I take myself back from this capitalist story that I can only arrive when I have X, Y, and Z
Hmm.
materially. And it's claiming that I have arrived already right now. In any moment, I have arrived. I have what I need. I am enough. Life is enough as it is. And then I am home is, claiming right here, right now, this is my home. This moment is my home. I can occupy fully this moment and claim my belonging to everything, to everyone right here, right now. So it's not that our home is somewhere outside, that we can be taken from, or that it can be destroyed, but our home is in the present moment. And so all of Thai's teachings were to bring that home to us. So whether it was mindful breathing, mindful walking, which were the two essential practices that he taught over and over, those were the basic practices. And it seemed so simple and so kind of, it couldn't be that simple, right? And he wanted to complicate it more. But that was it. If you could walk mindfully, breathe mindfully, that was his basically promise that you could feel, I have arrived, I am home in every moment if you stayed with your breath, if you stayed with your steps. Um, but I would add that there were a big part of his teaching was you awaken through community, and and that building community, being part of community, is really the heart of the path. And so a lot of teachings on loving speech and deep listening and forgiveness and starting over, beginning anew, a lot of things to help, a lot of real innovations, really. Um, I mean, he talked about our monastic centers as laboratories where we could really test and try out practices that are very helpful in the world and outside of monasteries in terms of resolving conflicts and getting everyone's insight and making decisions collectively and taking care of everyone. And there was just so much wisdom from the monastic lineage that he was a part of, all that goes all the way back to the Buddha. But also he wove in, Western psychology and science um, and the arts and literature. And he was extremely well read and, well educated in Western um, subjects, in addition to an incredibly deep um, being such a profound scholar of Chinese, Vietnamese, Buddhist sutras and commentaries, and did a lot of comparative religious study and bringing Christianity and Buddhism into conversation, and started neuroscience retreats. Anyway, he brought in so much of the world into his teachings. So in addition to the mindful breathing, mindful walking, and community, there was the teaching on engaged practice of really manifesting awakening in the world, in how we look at, what's happening, injustices, oppression, war, violence, and that our practice needs to be responsive to those things and have something to say that can be helpful in those situations.
Yeah, I'm a great admirer of the engaged Buddhism tradition, and yeah, it really seems to me that a pitfall that you see quite often in Western spirituality is taking one's own relief of suffering and deepening into the absolute as the kind of endpoint, where it's kind of there's almost a level of disconnect that can happen where it really feels individualistic. And to me, that there's still some delusion operating there if you think you genuinely are a separate individual whose spiritual life is separate from the unfolding of your relations and causes going on in the wider world.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. There's a beautiful quote of Thich Nhat Hanh where he says, "We're here to awaken from the delusion of our separateness."
Yeah, exactly. And so how many years were you a nun?
I was a nun for 15 years.
15. And then over that time, this may be impossible to articulate. I guess I'm interested in how your practice changed and deepened and what kind of experiential shifts you went through, and if there's anything you can say to, it's just such a large period of time.
Yeah. So it was from age 25 to 40. And I first came to Plum Village when I was 23. So I think a big part of my transformation in that time was learning to love myself and to befriend myself. I had a lot of, oh boy, I still do, but just a lot of healing to do. And I think one of the things that was really getting healed in me was my pain around my parents' divorce and my mom's mental illness. My mom was diagnosed with bipolar when I was 1. And so there was just a lot of, I had a fear that I might become sick like she was, like she became, like when I turned around 33, I think I had a lot of like worry that I was going to get sick and have the same thing happen to me. And I didn't really know that was happening under the surface, but with the practice, I started to see these were the things that were kind of pushing me from underneath. And I remember I asked a number of sisters that I trusted to just be a listening circle for me one time. And I just poured out all of my kind of the suffering of my childhood and kind of the things that I had, was struggling with or afraid of. And I, in those days, I guess 70s, 80s, 90s, it wasn't as, there was a lot more stigma around mental illness. Now it's there's much more acceptance and destigmatization, but I didn't really know how to talk about it comfortably for much of my life. And those steps of beginning to share those deeper wounds with people that I trusted were very healing. And, my 33rd year came and went, and I didn't, have a mental illness. And so that was a huge thing too. And I could write to Ty about these things, and Ty could, the process as monastics, because he had so many disciples, we could write to him and ask him questions, and he would address them in his Dharma talks. But he really tried to reassure me. He would say, there's many things in each of us, in our genetics, in our family lineages. But he said, it depends on your environment, whether those genes are turned on or not. If you practice, if you live in a way where you take good care of yourself, where you have loving and sane relationships with others, then those seeds, even though they're in you, they won't get turned on, those genes. And all these things were very, reassuring. And so there was certain things I think that intense, pressurized experience of monastic life, they helped certain things come up and really work themselves through my psyche. And another time, this was earlier, before this kind of crisis of my own, will I be like my mom? But before that, I also had a moment where I was super hard on myself, thinking I needed to be mindful all the time. I mean, that was kind of the expressed, that was Thais, had a high, basically we were all trying to be Zen masters like him. We were practicing to be mindful all the time. And I really took it so literally that like I couldn't be mindful 24 hours a day. And I fell into a depression. And for like 2 months, and I hadn't had that before. I haven't had that since. Where I really was so down on myself, and lovingly supported by mentors, sisters that I trusted, but still it just persisted until I was able to be in a service situation where I was guiding a group with another sister during a retreat. We were in our own separate little hamlet, and that really helped me to see I have something to offer here. I really do have a role to play that can be helpful to others. And that's what helped me to really move out of that depression. But I think what I could say of that 15 years overall was I learned to love myself, even though I'm still learning that, but I was less harsh with myself and saw more of my goodness, and also saw my weaknesses. That was one of the great gifts of monastic life. Was every year we had a 3-year rains retreat, a winter retreat. At the end of that time, we all had shining light. This is a practice where the community of sisters and the brothers would do it among themselves. We would sit down, and each person would hear from the community what their strengths were and where they could grow. What were the things that they were still maybe caught in, or that they could transform. So it would be condensed into a letter at the end of the winter retreat. So you get the wisdom of the people who really know you, because they live with you and they see when you're stressed or when you're not able to process something. They see when you really shine and when you are able to live deeply and mindfully. And so sometimes they would share positive things that I didn't really see in myself and didn't know how to appreciate. Or sometimes they would show me things that I really needed to see, that were quite painful to see, or somehow just were very helpful to point out, so I could know, okay, this is a direction to go in. I was always grateful for those shining light letters, because for the most part, we gave each other feedback from a place of love. And you could tell if someone was just, taking it out on someone else. And that really wasn't the purpose of shining light. It wasn't, a place to beat up on each other. And for the most part, people really looked deeply to see, we knew who it would be each session. So you could have time to think and, kind of condense what it is that you really want that person to hear from you, and make sure it was coming from your love, not from resentment. And so imagine the wealth of that, right? So
Yeah.
those things I think really helped me as well to just become, clearer in my mind and heart and a better practitioner. Um, so overall, I would say I think I came away from those 15 years in the monastery very clear about what my path was, even as I decided to leave. Thai is always my teacher, and I'm, gone on to embrace also the Vipassana Insight tradition as another tradition that I also practice and teach in. Um, but like I haven't ever questioned the purpose of my life, even as I knew as I was leaving monastic life, I didn't know exactly how the next step was going to unfold, but practice was always my foundation. I never let go of the practice, and that's always supported and held me and guided me. And the community, different. Now it's a different kind of lay community and lots of different ways of experiencing community outside of the monastery. But I really feel like my Thai has given me a path for the whole of my life and probably many lives. Um, and so, you know, there's a deep confidence in this path that I have and in myself as a practitioner, not in a proudful way, but just like, yes, Buddha nature is in every single one of us, including in me. And I can awaken to it more and more each day. Um,
I heard you say in an interview the idea of freshness. That word kind of really captures the essence of
yeah.
Buddha nature.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that teaching of Thai that one way to talk about Buddha nature is freshness, this ability to see things with new eyes, to um, basically, it's this teaching I have arrived, I am home. It's seeing each moment as a gift, as a miracle, as a moment that's never come before, as a moment that will never come again. And so, what does that invoke except freshness in our minds? Let me be here. Let me fully take in this moment and show up uh, as, fully as I can.
I think when people first face impermanence, there can be a lot of struggle around fearing loss, and but it seems to me that this freshness is the flip side of impermanence. That no matter what happens, everything will
Mm,
be washed clean, and there will just be this fresh present moment eternally.
mm, mm, I love that. That's beautiful.
The I also heard you talk about how play was a big part of your time
Mhm,
at Plum Village, and
mhm.
that you
Yeah.
learned a practice called interplay. Could you share about that?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. You know a lot about me.
I've been listening to some podcasts and reading your books, doing some prep.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
um, um, so So I was a dancer growing up. I really loved dance, and as a child I did ballet and then jazz, modern improvisational movement in college and theater, and really loved, the expressive arts. And so I was so happy when I became a nun because that was all really welcomed there. You wouldn't People don't often think of monasteries as places where you do plays
Right.
and theater and dances, but we did that all the time because we had so many festivals. And Ty really encouraged us. He was always saying, "Write a song," and write a poem. And he would say that to everyone. Everyone, write a song. That would be like our assignment, for like a week or something. So he was always, and he is so creative. He was, as right as a poet, as a playwright and novelist. He did so many creative things. He did calligraphy. He composed songs. One time he said, I was meditating and this song just kept coming into my head. And I thought, let me just stop meditating and write it down because it's bothering me. Anyway, um, so we would create dances, we would create plays and do art and make things with our hands, cards and different things to sell in the bookstore just to adorn our monastery. But one of the things that I really enjoyed, a friend of mine introduced me to when I was a nun. She had just come from an interplay retreat where she learned about it, and she shared some of the practices with me. And I was like, right away, I was like, this is great. And I started to do it with people at the monastery. That was in 2005. And then when I disrobed in 2014 or 2015, I quickly did the teacher training to be but I had been teaching interplay all that time, leading workshops, sort of like hour-long or 2-hour-long experiences for people to really touch their body wisdom, to get in touch with the wisdom of the body. So there would be, a warm-up and then like movement practices, like just walking around the room in different ways, just to kind of feel into your body, feel into the space. All of the essence of interplay is you give people a container within which to do something that there is no, expectation of what it should be. It could be anything, but it's within this container. So one is like, okay, you can walk around the room, either walking, running, or stopping. And any of those combinations you can do. And then you might put on music, and people would find a lot of freedom in just something that simple, just getting to choose with other people in space when to walk, when to run, when to stop. And there would be laughter, and there would be, silliness, and you would ask people at the end, oh, so what did you notice? And they would say, oh, I felt like a child, or it was so fun to run inside. It's, things that you don't usually get to do I always think of it as like in our regular life, there's about this much latitude for what you can do with your body and your mind and telling your stories. And interplay does this. And it gives you so much more that you're allowed to play with in the most basic, simple things, right? So there would be things where you would be speaking, there would be things where you would be moving, you could use music, you could use the music of the group, people could make music for each other to dance to. I mean, it was such a great form to share, and I loved sharing it in the community. And then I loved getting the full training when I left, and I had led, full week-long retreats where we do interplay and combine it with mindfulness and the arts, or, basically every retreat that I offer now, I bring in at least an hour of that experience of just being free in the body, improvising, playing.
It was interesting that when you were describing your experience over the 15 years in the monastery, there was a lot in the emotion spectrum in terms of, processing stuff there. And so if someone was in a cell, doing Vipassana for that length of time, they might have told a story about jhanas and, these profoundly altered states and with like absorption and concentration. And it's interesting to me because I often wonder with monastics, where there isn't like Western style psychotherapy going on, like what happens in the emotion space. And what you described is really illuminating in terms of how natural human, I guess the presence of relationality, the emphasis on community. You said earlier, right, that Thich Nhat Hanh said that community was a hugely important aspect of this. I wonder if just being in that communal context, playing, not denying the relative, really staying in touch with it, allows this stuff to just kind of come out and be the emotion stuff to come out and be expressed and resolved in a really kind of organic, natural way.
Yeah, I think, a bunch of things were happening. So on one side, Ty was often teaching about healing and emotions. He taught a lot about emotions. I actually, as a novice, was the first book I was asked to edit of his was on anger, this New York Times bestseller, Anger, Wisdom for Cooling the Flames. So he was always, that was a key part of his teaching, was how to care for and understand our emotions. And he was always hearing people's life stories and like their suffering of their family or their childhood, or he was kind of like a Maha therapist in the sense that he was always hearing people's true lived experience and often a lot of suffering, and helping them transform it with his teachings. So people would come and share very, I was abused, sexually abused by, some family member. And, he would, that would come out in a Dharma talk. I mean, it was like all the things that were happening in society, all the ways people had been, hurt. Um, he would talk about those. So all of us found ourselves addressed somehow in our personal lives by these teachings. Like none of us, I think, could go through that monastic experience and not examine our own lives. Because every week we were doing Touching the Earth, where we were asked to contemplate who were our parents? What did they pass on to us that was wholesome and beautiful? What did they pass on to us that was their suffering that we now experience as our suffering? Like that was like constantly happening for all of us. We were looking at, who am I? Why do I react in these ways? Why do I go numb in these situations? Why am I so good at this? Beautiful quality that comes from my ancestors, so it was a very much like psychological atmosphere. Like you couldn't stay numb to those things in that kind of environment because everyone was doing that kind of exploration, whether it was your monastic, friends, colleagues, or the lay people that were coming. Pretty soon after you're a monastic for a few years, you start mentoring people, you start offering one-on-ones on retreat. So people are coming to you with all of their, we would do retreats for thousands of people. And so you would have, you'd see 40 people on a week-long retreat, like a therapist, basically, but you were just practicing mindfulness for, 4 or 5 years. But you would sit there and listen deeply and respond from your heart. So we were getting therapy training by osmosis, from Thai, the great listener who could just, because there were all these Q&A sessions at the end, every retreat had a live Q&A where people would come up and ask a question, and you would see transformation happen in front of your eyes, where Thai would listen and give an answer or a response that would often be, I would often think, how is he going to respond? This is so intense. This is so difficult. And he always had a way to hold that person or that situation like so skillfully. So we were absorbing all of this. And anyway, just to say, we had to be that person for people quickly in our training. So if we weren't doing the work of understanding our own psychology and our own wounds, we couldn't show up properly for people who needed our help. So that was one piece. And there was another part I wanted to say that I forgot now with the play. Oh, it was about interplay, which has this understanding of things being like the way that this process of playing with material in our consciousness can kind of open doors unintentionally or not rationally. They called it sneaky deep. So you'd be, I would lead, this would happen in the monastery. I would lead a session of interplay where put on music and you have one person do a dance with one hand and another person just watches, just is the witness. But sometimes you would do it where you each share what's something that's on your heart. One person shares, and the other person does a one-hand dance on behalf of you. So whatever they've heard you share, they just move their hand to the music. And I remember people breaking into tears in these sessions, like people going through really serious things like cancer. And the one-hand dance of their partner would open doors for them or would help them grieve or would help them touch things. It's so amazing how like there's this mystery that we can tap into when we get out of our mind and words and we just go into our body. That's what the whole thing of body wisdom. I remember one time I was doing a one-hand dance with a friend. I didn't know what happened to her, but I kept doing movements with my hand around my forehead and my nose for no reason. I had no idea. But I was just moved. And she said when we shared, I had a bike accident where I hit my nose and I hit my forehead. And what you were doing was so evocative of healing for me. That happens all the time in interplay. So it's this sneaky deep way where playfulness helps the nervous system to feel safe. gets us into our childlike
Hmm.
mind, and then all sorts of healing can happen. So that really was part of the magic of Plum Village and all the monasteries. Was we were always playing, as we were, most of us were young, for one thing. I mean, there were plenty of different ages, but the majority of the monastics were in their 20s, 30s, I would say. So we were playing volleyball together, basketball, rollerblading around the meditation hall, thinking of fun things to do together a lot, even as we were very dedicated to our mindfulness practice. So people would come there and experience so much joy. I remember one time someone coming, this was in Deer Park in California, saying, "This is the most, joyful Christmas I've ever experienced at a Buddhist monastery. It's the happiest Christmas I've ever had." And he was, probably in his 60s by then. So all of that, way of being in the moment, being present with ourselves and our pain, transforming our pain, knowing that was really a key part of our path as practitioners, allowed us to have this incredibly deep joy that people could just tap into as soon as they got there. They could feel it, that, wow, this is something different.
I wonder if earlier when I was asking about the average person, maybe being bemused about why one would choose monastic life, maybe they don't understand there's rollerblading and lots of fun things to do as well. But
Sneaking off to movies, getting
yeah,
caught by lay people at the
yeah.
movies, like, oops. We only did that once, just so.
Um, and so on the you meant we spoke about engaged Buddhism before, and
Mm.
you're very active in the kind of Ecodharma movement. Taking this wisdom into ecological awareness, and yeah, I think that's a hugely important piece of the puzzle. Where it feels to me that the root cause of climate crisis, ecological breakdown, is our perceived separation, is our sense of feeling separate from the natural world, and that the deepest healing can only come if person by person basis there's a reorienting to those kinds of practices. Um, is that the kind of thing that calls you to Ecodharma, that kind of moving towards wholeness and connection with the natural world?
Absolutely. And the fact that that's the only thing that could possibly help us avoid,
Yeah.
catastrophic. I mean, I don't think we're going to be able to avoid completely. I mean, total collapse. I think there's going to be some kind of collapse that's going to happen. And whether or not, as humans, we were able to continue depends on our ability to see ourselves as one with the natural world, with the living world, with life, with all of life. I was just I have to go pretty soon. I actually have a call soon, but
Okay.
I was at a wonderful gathering just yesterday on moral economics. And one of the presenters, David Bollier, who studies the commons, taking um, a lot of it from what's, is so common. England is so famous for the commons, and a lot of other European countries. But he was talking about how there's such an emphasis in capitalism on each individual unit or being, and what the commons emphasizes, and what really any, you know, successful system emphasizes more the connections, the relationships between. Like that's actually where what produces strength and resilience, and so this whole, area of ecodharma uh, of practicing a spiritual path that is fundamentally intertwined with our relationship with the world and species, all species, all of life, is relationships. Like we survive because of relationships. We thrive because of relationships. And so ecodharma is really like we can't make it without this. And hopefully we will make it, but as a species, I mean, the earth will make it. but it feels like a fundamental piece to the next, it is just a description of how life is. We are interconnected. We are
Right.
incredibly interwoven, and, only we don't seem to know that as humans. And so that's why we're destroying so much of this beautiful planet. But if we can wake up to it, and many of us are, and we need a lot more of us to, our systems, our all of our structures need to wake up to it, then there could be some chance.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for your time. I've really, really enjoyed this.
Yeah. Thank you, James. Me too.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.